Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore what food was served at Wild West saloons during the American frontier period. This is going to be an extremely detailed, methodical examination of the meals, ingredients, cooking methods, and dining experiences in these frontier establishments that will hopefully help you drift off to sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a long, thorough, and decidedly boring journey through Wild West saloon cuisine. To understand what food was served at Wild West saloons, we must first establish what these establishments were, where they existed, and what functions they served in frontier communities. The saloon was a central institution in American frontier life during the period roughly from the 1850s through the early 1900s, and it served multiple purposes beyond simply providing alcoholic beverages. The term Wild West refers to the American frontier regions west of the Mississippi River during the late 19th century, particularly during the period of westward expansion, gold rushes, cattle drives, and settlement of the Great Plains and Western Territories. This was a time of rapid change, migration, and development in American history, and the saloon was an institution that emerged to meet the needs of frontier populations. Saloons were primarily drinking establishments, where men would gather to consume alcohol, socialize, gamble, and conduct business. The consumption of alcoholic beverages was the central activity, with beer and whiskey being the most commonly served drinks. However, saloons also provided other services, including food service, which is our focus in this examination. The food served in saloons ranged from simple free snacks meant to encourage drinking to full meals that could sustain working men. The location of saloons varied from small frontier towns, with populations of a few hundred, to larger cattle towns and mining communities with thousands of residents. Saloons could be found in rough mining camps in California, Colorado, Nevada, and other mineral-rich regions. They existed in cattle towns in Kansas, Texas, and other ranching areas where cowboys would gather after long cattle drives. They were present in railroad towns that sprang up along the expanding rail lines. They could be found in farming communities, logging camps, military posts, and anywhere else that American settlers and workers gathered. The physical structure of saloons varied considerably depending on the wealth of the community and the ambitions of the saloon owner. In the earliest and roughest frontier settlements, a saloon might be nothing more than a tent with a plank laid across two barrels, serving as a bar. As communities became more established, saloons would be built from wood, typically long, narrow buildings with a bar running along one side, tables and chairs in the main room, and perhaps additional rooms for gambling or other activities. The most elaborate saloons in wealthy mining towns or cattle shipping centers might have ornate bars made of imported wood, large mirrors, gas lighting, or even early electric lighting, and relatively luxurious furnishings. The clientele of saloons consisted primarily of working-class men, including cowboys, miners, railroad workers, soldiers, freighters, trappers, and laborers of various kinds. Saloons were male-dominated spaces where women were generally not welcome as customers, though women might work in saloons as servers, entertainers, or in other capacities. The rough, masculine atmosphere of saloons shaped the types of food that were served and the manner in which meals were provided and consumed. The economic model of saloons was based primarily on alcohol sales, which provided the bulk of revenue and profit. Food service was often seen as a secondary consideration, a way to attract and retain customers who would then purchase drinks. Some saloons offered free food as an enticement, a practice called a free lunch that we will examine in detail. Other saloons charged for food, either as individual meal purchases or as part of boarding arrangements for regular customers. The economic logic of food service in saloons was always tied to the primary business of selling alcohol. The hours of operation for saloons were generally long, often from early morning until late at night, 7 days a week. This meant that food service had to be available throughout the day to accommodate customers who might want breakfast, dinner, supper, or a snack at any hour. The kitchen operations, such as they were, had to be organized to provide food across this extended schedule with whatever staff and facilities were available. The competition among saloons in towns large enough to support multiple establishments meant that food could be a differentiating factor. A saloon that offered better food, more generous portions, or more varied selections might attract more customers than competitors who provided inferior fare. However, given that most saloon customers were more interested in drinking than in fine dining, the pressure to provide high-quality food was limited, and most saloons settled for providing adequate sustenance at minimal cost. Understanding this context is essential before we examine the actual food served in saloons. The food was shaped by the frontier environment, by the limitations of available ingredients and cooking facilities, by the preferences of the working-class male clientele, by the economic constraints of saloon operators, and by the primary focus on alcohol sales rather than food service. With this context established, we can now turn to examining the specific foods, meals, and dining experiences that characterized Wild West saloons. Chapter 2. The free lunch tradition. One of the most distinctive features of saloon food service was the institution of the free lunch, which was a spread of food made available to customers at no charge, though with the expectation that customers would purchase drinks. Let us examine this practice in detail, as it was central to the food culture of Wild West saloons. The free lunch concept originated in Eastern American cities in the early to mid-19th century and spread westward with the frontier. The basic idea was that a saloon would set out a table or bar area with various food items that customers could eat without charge. The catch was that the free lunch was only available to customers who were drinking, and typically a customer needed to purchase at least one drink to access the food. The saloon made its profit not from the food, but from the drinks that customers purchased while eating. The foods offered as free lunch varied depending on the saloon's budget, the availability of ingredients, and the ambitions of the proprietor, but there were common patterns. The foods tended to be inexpensive to purchase or prepare, filling enough to satisfy hungry workers, and often deliberately salty to encourage drinking. Let us examine the typical components of a saloon free lunch in methodical detail. Bread was a staple of the free lunch spread. Saloons would provide loaves of wheat bread, rye bread, or cornbread that customers could slice and eat. The bread might be fresh if the saloon had access to a local bakery, or if bread was baked on premises, or it might be somewhat stale if it had been sitting out for several hours or even days. The bread served as a filler food that would help satisfy hunger without costing the saloon much money. Customers would typically eat the bread plain or might spread it with butter if butter was provided, though butter was not always available as it required refrigeration, which many saloons lacked. Cheese was another common component of free lunches. Hard cheeses that could survive without refrigeration were typical, including aged cheddar, which was produced domestically in various regions, and sometimes imported cheeses if the saloon had access to suppliers. The cheese would be cut into slices or cubes and placed on the free lunch table. Customers would help themselves to cheese, perhaps placing it on bread to make a simple sandwich. The saltiness of aged cheese had the added benefit, from the saloon's perspective, of making customers thirsty and encouraging to purchase more drinks. Pickled vegetables were a mainstay of saloon free lunches. Pickles, which were cucumbers, preserved in vinegar and salt, were inexpensive and could be stored for long periods without refrigeration. Saloons would purchase pickles by the barrel from commercial producers or from local farmers who preserved their surplus cucumbers. The pickles would be placed in bowls or jars on the free lunch table, and customers would help themselves. The salty, vinegary flavor of pickles was popular with the working men who frequented saloons and again had the advantage of encouraging drinking. Pickled eggs were another common item. Hard-boiled eggs would be preserved in vinegar with spices, creating a tangy, salty snack that could be stored at room temperature. Pickled eggs were cheap to prepare, as eggs were readily available in most frontier communities, and they provided protein to customers. A customer might eat several pickled eggs along with bread and pickles as a simple meal while drinking beer or whiskey. Salted or smoked fish was sometimes included in free lunch spreads, particularly in saloons that had access to fish through trade or local fishing. Salted herring was a common option, as it was inexpensive, could be stored without refrigeration, and was quite salty, encouraging drink purchases. Smoked salmon or other fish might be available in regions where fish was plentiful. The fish would be cut into small pieces and placed on the free lunch table for customers to eat with bread or crackers. Crackers or hardtack were provided as an alternative to bread. In some saloons, crackers were inexpensive, could be purchased in bulk, and could be stored almost indefinitely without spoiling. Hardtack, which was a type of very hard cracker made from flour, water, and salt that had been developed as a military and ship ration, was sometimes available in frontier areas and could be softened somewhat by dunking in drinks or by eating with other foods. Salted meats including ham, corned beef, or bacon were featured in more generous free lunch spreads. These preserved meats were expensive relative to bread, cheese, and pickles, but they were popular with customers and could help attract business. The meat would be sliced thin and arranged on platters, Customers might make sandwiches with the meat and bread, or might simply eat slices of meat along with other foods. The high salt content of these preserved meats served the usual purpose of encouraging drinking. Sausages, including salami, summer sausage, and other cured sausages that did not require refrigeration, were sometimes offered. These sausages were made from pork, beef, or mixtures of meats that were heavily salted and smoked or dried for preservation. They could be sliced and eaten as snacks or used in sandwiches. Sausages were relatively expensive, but were popular and could justify their cost by attracting customers. Onions, either raw or pickled, were common accompaniments to free lunch foods. Raw onions could be sliced and placed on the table for customers to add to sandwiches or to eat alongside other foods. Pickled onions were tangy and flavorful additions to the spread. Onions were inexpensive and were available in most frontier communities, making them an economical option for saloons. Radishes and other raw vegetables might be included seasonally when they were available from local farms or gardens. Radishes were particularly popular as they required minimal preparation, could be eaten raw, and had a sharp, spicy flavor that complemented other foods. Other raw vegetables, including carrots, turnips, or celery, might be offered when in season and available locally. Mustard and horseradish were condiments that might be available for customers to add to their food. These condiments were used to add flavor to bland foods and to enhance sandwiches. Mustard was readily available as a commercial product and was inexpensive. Horseradish, which was a pungent root that could be grated and preserved in vinegar, was popular with customers who enjoyed strong flavors. Boiled eggs, not pickled but simply hard-boiled and kept available for customers, were a simple protein option that some saloons offered. Hard-boiled eggs could be prepared in large batches and could be stored for a day or two without major food safety concerns, though they would not last as long as pickled eggs. Customers might eat boiled eggs with salt, which was always available on the table. The quantities of food provided as free lunch varied depending on the saloon's policy and budget. Some saloons set out generous amounts and allowed customers to eat as much as they wanted, reasoning that well-fed customers would stay longer and drink more. Other saloons provided more limited quantities and might enforce informal limits on how much food any one customer could take, particularly if customers were not drinking heavily. There was always a tension between wanting to attract customers with free food and not wanting to be taken advantage of by hungry men who might eat large amounts without purchasing many drinks. The presentation of free lunch ranged from crude to relatively refined. In rough saloons, in early frontier settlements, the food might simply be piled on a table or on the bar with no plates or utensils, and customers would grab food with their hands. In better established saloons, the free lunch might be arranged more carefully on platters, with plates and forks available for customers to use. Some saloons employed a server to manage the free lunch spread, to replenish items as they ran out, and to discourage excessive consumption by non-drinking customers. The timing of free lunch service varied, but it was typically offered during midday hours when working men would take breaks and would want something to eat. The free lunch might be available from late morning through mid-afternoon, covering the traditional dinner hour when main meals were consumed. Some saloons extended free lunch availability throughout the afternoon and into the early evening. A few Pole saloons offered free lunch at all hours when they were open, though this was less common due to the cost and effort involved. The Pulse Laureate free lunch tradition was significant in frontier communities because it provided access to food for working men who might not have other convenient meal options. Cowboys, miners, and laborers who were working in remote areas might depend on saloon free lunches as a primary food source. The food was basic but was generally adequate in quantity and nutrition to sustain hard physical labor. The free lunch thus served a social function beyond just encouraging alcohol sales, providing a practical service to working populations. However, the free lunch also had its critics and its problems. Temperance advocates who opposed alcohol consumption criticized free lunches as deceptive enticements that encouraged drinking. Saloon owners sometimes complained about customers who would eat large amounts of food while nursing a single cheap drink for hours. The informality of free lunches and the lack of hygiene standards meant that food safety was often compromised, with food sitting out at room temperature for hours and being handled by many unwashed hands. Despite these issues, the free lunch remained a fixture of saloon culture throughout the frontier period. Chapter 3. Prepared hot meals and dinner service. Beyond the free lunch, many saloons also served prepared hot meals to customers, either as a regular part of their business or as a special service. Let us examine in detail what these meals consisted of, how they were prepared, and what the dining experience was like. The decision to offer hot meals depended on several factors, including the saloon's facilities, the availability of staff to cook, the presence of competing restaurants or boarding houses, and the owner's business strategy. In small frontier settlements with few eating establishments, saloons might be one of the only places where men could get a hot meal, making meal service a practical necessity. In larger towns with multiple dining options, saloons might focus primarily on drinks and free lunch while leaving full meal service to dedicated restaurants. The kitchen facilities in saloons ranged from non-existent to reasonably well-equipped. Some saloons had no full dining options. Saloons might focus primarily on drinks and free lunch while leaving full meal service to dedicated restaurants. The kitchen facilities in saloons ranged from non-existent to reasonably well-equipped. Some saloons had no kitchen at all and could not provide hot meals, relying entirely on free lunch spreads of cold foods. Other saloons had a small stove or range in a back room, or in a corner of the main room where simple cooking could be done. The better saloons might have a dedicated kitchen with multiple stoves, work tables, and storage for ingredients and equipment. The quality and variety of hot meals that could be served depended entirely on these facilities. The cooking staff in saloons consisted of whoever was available and willing to do the work. In Stummigamot, in Swasham, the saloon owner or bartender might do the cooking themselves when time permitted. Larger saloons might employ a cook who would be responsible for preparing both the free lunch items and any hot meals that were ordered. The cook in a frontier saloon was typically not a trained chef, but was simply someone who could produce basic, filling food in quantity. The pay for saloon cooks was low, and the working conditions were difficult, with long hours in hot, cramped kitchens. The timing of hot meal service usually corresponded to traditional meal times. Breakfast might be served in the morning for customers who lived in rooms above the saloon or who wanted an early meal before work. Dinner, which was the main meal of the day and was eaten at midday in the 19th century, was the most common time for saloons to bookend meal times. Breakfast might be served in the morning for customers who lived in rooms above the saloon or who wanted an early meal before work. Dinner, which was the main meal of the day and was eaten at midday in the 19th century, was the most common time for saloons to serve hot meals. Supper, the evening meal, might also be available, particularly in saloons that catered to boarders or that wanted to keep customers on premises into the evening. The menu in saloons was limited and repetitive, reflecting the constraints of ingredients, cooking facilities, and the conservative tastes of the clientele. Let us examine the typical dishes that would be served as hot meals in Wild West saloons. Beef stew was one of the most common hot dishes served in saloons. Stew was practical for several reasons. It could be made in large quantities in a single pot. It used inexpensive cuts of beef that would become tender through long, slow cooking. It could incorporate vegetables that were locally available, and it could be kept warm on the stove and served throughout the day as customers ordered it. A typical saloon beef stew would contain chunks of beef, potatoes, onions, carrots if available, and perhaps other vegetables like turnips or cabbage. The stew would be seasoned with salt and pepper and perhaps some herbs if available. It would be served in bowls with bread on the side. Beans were a frontier staple and were served in various forms in saloons. Pinto beans, navy beans, or other dried beans would be soaked overnight and then cooked slowly with salt pork, onions, and seasonings until soft and flavorful. The resulting dish was thick, filling, and inexpensive to produce. Beans were rich in protein and could sustain workers through long days of physical labor. They were served in bowls or on plates, often with cornbread or biscuits. Some saloons became known for their beans and would serve them daily as a standard offering. Chili con carne, which was a spicy stew of meat and chili peppers, was served in saloons in Texas and in other regions where Mexican and American cultures intersected. The dish reflected the Mexican culinary influence in the Southwest and was popular with cowboys and other workers. Saloon chili would be made with beef, chili peppers, onions, garlic, and tomatoes if available, seasoned with cumin and other spices. It would be served in bowls with crackers or cornbread. The spiciness varied depending on the cook's preferences and the availability of peppers. Fried or roasted meats were served when saloons could obtain fresh meat from local butchers or from hunters. Beef steaks would be cut from larger cuts of beef and fried in a pan with lard or bacon grease, seasoned simply with salt and pepper. Pork chops might be prepared the same way. Roasted beef might be cooked in an oven if the saloon had one, then sliced and served. these meat dishes were more expensive than stews or beans and would be charged at higher prices. They were special offerings rather than everyday staples. Fried chicken was available in some saloons, particularly in regions where chickens were raised locally. The chicken would be cut into pieces, dredged in flour, seasoned with salt and pepper, and fried in lard or other fat until crispy. Fried chicken was labor-intensive to prepare and required fresh poultry, so it was not an everyday offering but might be served on special occasions or as a premium menu item. Bacon and eggs was a common breakfast offering in saloons. Thick slices of bacon would be fried until crisp, and eggs would be fried in the bacon grease. The meal would be served with bread or biscuits, and perhaps with fried potatoes if available. This was a simple, hearty breakfast that would sustain a working man through the morning. The bacon would be cut from slabs of salt pork that saloons kept on hand, and eggs would be purchased from local farmers or from the saloon's own chickens, if they kept any. Biscuits and gravy was another breakfast staple in frontier saloons. Biscuits would be made from flour, baking powder, salt, and lard, mixed quickly and baked until risen and golden. Gravy would be made from flour browned in bacon, grease, or other fat, then mixed with milk, if available, or with water, and seasoned with salt and pepper. The biscuits would be split open and smothered with gravy, creating a cheap, filling breakfast. This dish required minimal ingredients and could be prepared quickly, making it ideal for the saloon kitchens. Fried potatoes or boiled potatoes were common side dishes that accompanied meat dishes. Potatoes were widely available, inexpensive, and filling. They could be peeled and boiled until soft, then served plain or mashed with butter if available. Alternatively, they could be sliced and fried in fat until crispy. Potatoes added bulk to meals and helped satisfy hungry customers. Cornbread was served as a bread option in regions where corn was more available than wheat. Cornmeal would be mixed with water or milk, eggs if available, salt, and baking powder, then baked in a pan until golden. The resulting cornbread would be cut into squares and served warm. Cornbread was particularly common in southern and southwestern saloons where corn was a dietary staple. Soups of various kinds might be offered as lighter meal options or as economical ways to use up leftover ingredients. Vegetable soup could be made from whatever vegetables were available, cooked in water or broth with seasonings. Bean soup was similar to the bean dishes described earlier but with more liquid. Soup would be served in bowls with bread or crackers. The portions served in saloons were typically generous, reflecting the hearty appetites of working men and the emphasis on providing filling meals rather than refined cuisine. A serving of stew or beans would be a large bowlful, enough to satisfy a hungry laborer. Meat portions would be substantial, with steaks or chops being thick cuts rather than delicate servings. The point and goal was to fill customers up, not to provide elegant dining experiences. The prices charged for hot meals in saloons varied by region, by the cost of ingredients, and by what the market would bear, but they were generally modest. A meal of stew or beans might cost 25 cents, while a more substantial meal with meat might cost 50 cents to $1. These prices were affordable for working men who were earning perhaps $1 or $2 per day. Though they represented a significant portion of daily wages, customers expected good value for their money, meaning ample portions of filling food. The dining experience in saloons was casual and functional rather than refined. Customers would sit at tables or at the bar, would order their food from the bartender or from a server if one was employed, and would be served their meal on simple plates with basic utensils. The atmosphere was noisy and rough, with men drinking, talking, gambling, and conducting business all around. Table manners were relaxed, and the focus was on eating quickly and efficiently rather than on savoring food or on social niceties. The quality of food in saloons ranged from barely edible to reasonably good, depending on the skill of the cook, the quality of ingredients, and the standards of the establishment. Some saloons became known for having particularly good food and would attract customers based on their culinary reputation. Other saloons served food that was merely functional, providing calories and nutrition without any pretension to taste or quality. Customers understood what to expect and adjusted their expectations accordingly. Chapter 4: Ingredients and Supply Chains. To understand what food was served in Wild West saloons, we must examine where the ingredients came from and how saloons obtained the supplies they needed to feed their customers. The frontier environment created significant challenges for food procurement, and these challenges shaped what could be served. The The most basic ingredient in saloon food was flour, which was used to make bread, biscuits, pie crusts, and as a thickener for gravies and stews. Flour was produced by grinding wheat, and it was available through commercial trade networks that extended into frontier regions. Mills in established agricultural regions would process wheat into flour, which would then be shipped west by wagon train, riverboat, or eventually by railroad. Flour was sold in large sacks, and saloons would purchase multiple sacks at a time to have adequate supplies. The cost of flour varied depending on how remote the location was and how difficult transportation was, but it was generally affordable and was a staple purchase. Cornmeal, which was made by grinding corn, was another essential ingredient, particularly in the South and Southwest. Corn was easier to grow in some frontier regions than wheat, and cornmeal was often cheaper than wheat flour. It was used to make cornbread, which was a staple of frontier diets. Saloons would purchase cornmeal in bulk, sacks similar to flour. Salt was absolutely essential for frontier food preparation, both for seasoning and for food preservation. Salt was used to preserve meats, to cure bacon and ham, to make pickles, and to season all dishes. The salt trade was well established, with salt being mined in various locations or produced by evaporating seawater in coastal areas. It would be shipped inland and sold in bulk. Saloons would keep large quantities of salt on hand and would use it liberally in their cooking. Sugar was another important commodity that was purchased from distant sources. Sugar was produced primarily in Louisiana and in tropical regions, and it was refined and shipped throughout the country. It was more expensive than salt or flour and was used more sparingly. Saloons would use sugar in baking, in coffee service, and in making desserts if they offered any. Brown sugar and molasses were sometimes available and were cheaper alternatives to refined white sugar. Coffee was an essential beverage in frontier communities and was consumed in large quantities. Coffee beans were imported from tropical regions, were roasted either at distant locations or sometimes locally, and were sold as whole beans that customers would grind before use. Saloons would purchase coffee in bulk and would keep large pots of coffee brewing throughout the day. The coffee served in saloons was typically strong and often harsh, made by boiling coarse grounds in water and serving the result without filtering out all the grounds. Tea was less commonly consumed than coffee in the American West, but was available in some saloons. Tea leaves were imported from Asia and were expensive relative to coffee. Tea service was more refined than coffee service and required proper brewing equipment, making it less practical for rough frontier saloons. Meats came from various sources depending on location and availability. Beef was the most common meat in cattle country, where ranches supplied fresh beef to local butchers. In frontier towns there would typically be at least one butcher shop, where saloons could purchase cuts of beef for cooking. The beef available would not be aged or particularly high quality but would be fresh enough to use. Prices would vary seasonally and based on local supply. Pork was also widely available and was often preserved as salt pork, bacon or ham for long-term storage. Fresh pork could be purchased from local farmers who raised pigs, but preserved pork was more reliable for saloons since it did not require immediate use. Salt pork was pork that had been heavily salted for preservation and could be stored for months. It would be sliced and fried or added to beans and stews for flavoring. Wild game, including deer, antelope, rabbit, and various birds, was available in some frontier regions and could supplement purchased meats. Hunters would bring game to saloons to sell, or saloon owners might hunt themselves if they had time and opportunity. Game meat was free-range and lean, and it would be prepared similarly to domestic meats, though cooking times and methods might need adjustment. Fish was available in areas near rivers, lakes, or the ocean. Fresh fish would be purchased from local fishermen and would need to be cooked promptly before spoiling. Salted or smoked fish could be purchased from commercial sources and could be stored longer. Fish was less central to frontier diets than meat, but provided variety when available. Eggs were an important ingredient and protein source. They were purchased from local farms or from townspeople who kept chickens. Eggs would be delivered to saloons regularly, perhaps several times per week, and would be stored in cool areas if possible. Eggs were relatively perishable compared to many frontier foods, but would keep for a week or two under proper conditions. They were used in baking and were fried or boiled for direct consumption. Milk and butter were luxury items in many frontier locations due to the difficulty of keeping them fresh without refrigeration. In towns with local dairy farms, fresh milk might be available daily, but it would need to be used quickly. Butter would be churned from cream and would be salted for preservation, but it would still be perishable and would need to be kept cool. Many saloons in remote locations had no access to fresh dairy products and would make do without them or would use canned condensed milk that became available in the late 19th century. Cheese, as mentioned earlier, was more practical than fresh milk or butter because hard cheeses could be aged and did not require refrigeration. Cheddar and similar cheeses could be purchased in large wheels or blocks and would keep for extended periods. Saloons would buy cheese from commercial suppliers or from local farmers who made their own cheese. Vegetables varied greatly by season and by location. In agricultural regions with farms near town, fresh vegetables would be available during the growing season, typically from late spring through early fall. Farmers would bring produce to town to sell, and saloons would purchase whatever was available, including potatoes, onions, carrots, cabbage, beans, peas, corn, tomatoes, and various other crops. During winter months, in most frontier regions, fresh vegetables would be scarce or unavailable, and saloons would rely on stored vegetables, like potatoes, onions, and dried beans. Preserved vegetables, including pickles and canned goods, became increasingly available as the 19th century progressed. Commercial pickle production supplied barrels of pickled cucumbers, onions, and other vegetables that could be purchased and stored. Canning technology, which developed in the mid-19th century, allowed vegetables and fruits to be preserved in sealed tin cans or glass jars. Canned goods were expensive initially, but became more affordable over time, and provided access to vegetables and fruits year-round. Dried beans, peas, and lentils were staple preserved foods that could be stored almost indefinitely and provide protein and bulk to meals. Saloons would keep large sacks of dried beans on hand and would prepare them regularly as cheap, filling dishes. The beans would be soaked overnight to rehydrate them and then cooked slowly until soft. Spices and seasonings beyond salt and pepper were generally limited in frontier saloons. Black pepper was available, but was relatively expensive and was used sparingly. Chili peppers and other spices were more common in southwestern regions with Mexican influence. Dried herbs might be used if they were locally grown or gathered. Most frontier cooking relied heavily on salt for flavoring with minimal additional seasonings. Lard, which is rendered pork fat, was the primary cooking fat used in frontier kitchens. It was used for frying, for greasing baking pans, for making pie crusts and biscuits, and for any purpose requiring fat. Lard could be purchased or could be rendered by pie saloons if they butchered their own pigs or purchased pork fat from butchers. It was stored in crocks or cans and would keep for months if protected from heat. Baking powder and baking soda were leavening agents used in biscuits, cakes, and other baked goods. These chemical leaveners became available in the mid to late 19th century and simplified baking by eliminating the need for maintaining sourdough starters or yeast cultures. Saloons would purchase these products in cans or boxes from general stores. The fly chains that brought these ingredients to frontier saloons were complex and often unreliable. In the early frontier period, supplies would be freighted overland by wagon trains, which was slow and expensive. River transportation was used where possible, with steamboats carrying goods up rivers like the Missouri and its tributaries. The development of railroads from the 1860s onward dramatically improved supply lines and made ingredients more consistently available and affordable. Saloons would typically purchase supplies from local general stores or merchants who served as intermediaries between distant suppliers and local businesses. The saloon owner or manager would make regular trips to these stores to stock up on flour, coffee, salt, canned goods, and other staples. Larger purchases might be negotiated directly with wholesalers who could provide bulk quantities at lower prices. The cost of ingredients was a significant concern for saloon operators, and they would seek the cheapest options that were adequate for their needs. The quality of ingredients was generally not high, and saloons accepted whatever was available at prices they could afford. Spoilage and waste were facts of life in the frontier environment, particularly for perishable foods, and saloons would factor these losses into their planning and pricing. The seasonal variations in ingredient availability meant that saloon menus would change throughout the year. Fresh vegetables and fruits would be featured in summer months when they were abundant and cheap. Winter menus would rely more heavily on preserved foods, dried goods, and storage crops like potatoes. These seasonal patterns were well understood by both saloon operators and customers, and expectations were adjusted accordingly. Understanding the ingredient supply chains and the challenges of obtaining food on the frontier helps us appreciate both what was possible in saloon kitchens, and what constraints shaped the menus. The food served in saloons was limited by what could be obtained, what could be stored, and what could be prepared with available facilities, and these limitations defined frontier saloon cuisine. Chapter 5. Beverages beyond alcohol. While saloons were primarily known for serving alcoholic beverages, they also provided various non-alcoholic drinks that were part of the food service experience. Let us examine in detail what non-alcoholic beverages were available and how they were prepared and served. Coffee was by far the most important non-alcoholic beverages served in Wild West saloons. It was consumed in enormous quantities throughout the frontier West and was considered essential by most working men. The preparation of coffee in saloons was simple and utilitarian rather than refined. Coffee beans would be ground, typically quite coarsely, and would be added directly to pots of boiling water. The mixture would be boiled for some time, allowing the coffee to brew, and then would be removed from heat. Some grounds would settle to the bottom of the pot, but much of the coffee grounds would remain suspended in the liquid, giving saloon coffee a thick, muddy quality. The coffee would be served in tin cups, ceramic mugs, or whatever vessels were available. It would be very strong, often bitter, and would be removed from heat. Some grounds would settle to the bottom of the pot, but much of the coffee grounds would remain suspended in the liquid, giving saloon coffee a thick, muddy quality. The coffee would be served in tin cups, ceramic mugs, or whatever vessels were available. It would be very strong, often bitter, and would contain considerable sediment. Customers would learn to drink carefully to avoid getting mouthfuls of grounds. Sugar might be available to add to coffee, and milk or cream might be offered if the saloon had access to dairy products, though many customers drank their coffee black simply because additions were not available or were too expensive. Coffee would be kept warm on the stove throughout the day, with new pots being made as needed. The quality would deteriorate as coffee sat for long periods, becoming more bitter and developing off flavors, but this was accepted as normal. Fresh pots of coffee would be made in the morning and would be replenished as necessary throughout the day. The continuous availability of coffee was an important service that saloons provided, as coffee was seen as essential for functioning and for socializing. The cost of coffee in saloons was typically nominal, perhaps 5 cents per cup, or it might be included free with meal purchases. Some saloons offered free coffee to customers who were drinking alcohol, reasoning that the coffee would help keep customers alert and drinking longer. The profit margin on coffee was low, but the service was expected by customers and was seen as a necessary amenity. Water was obviously available in saloons, though its quality and safety varied considerably. In towns with public water systems or good wells, water might be reasonably clean and safe. In other locations, water quality might be questionable and customers might prefer to avoid drinking it. Water would be kept in barrels, buckets, or pitchers and would be available for customers to drink, though it was not typically served with the same attention as other beverages. Many frontier residents believed, often correctly, that water was potentially unsafe and that alcoholic beverages or boiled beverages like coffee were safer choices. Tea was available in some saloons but was much less common than coffee. Tea was seen as more refined and perhaps more feminine than coffee, and it was not popular with the working-class male clientele of most saloons. When tea was offered, it would be brewed by steeping tea leaves in hot water and would be served in cups, possibly with sugar and milk if available. The tea service would be more careful than coffee service, as tea required steeping for the proper time and was not simply boiled like coffee. Milk was served in saloons that had access to fresh dairy products, though it was not a common beverage choice for adults. Children who accompanied parents to saloons might be given milk, and some men might drink milk with meals. The milk would be kept cool if possible, though without refrigeration it would not last more than a day or two in warm weather. The difficulty of maintaining fresh milk meant that many saloons simply did not offer it. Buttermilk, which is label, the liquid left after churning butter, was sometimes available and was consumed as a beverage. It had a fun, sour, tangy flavor that some people enjoyed, and it was seen as refreshing. Buttermilk would be available primarily in agricultural areas where dairy farming occurred, and like regular milk, it required relatively quick consumption before spoiling. Sarsaparilla was a non-alcoholic beverage that became popular in the late 19th century and was served in some saloons. It was a soft drink flavored with extracts from the sarsaparilla plant along with other flavoring ingredients, including wintergreen, vanilla, and various roots and herbs. sarsaparilla was sold commercially as a syrup that would be mixed with carbonated water, if available, or with plain water. It had a distinctive root beer-like flavor that was popular with customers who wanted a sweet, flavorful beverage. Root beer and other flavored soft drinks became increasingly available in the late frontier period as the commercial soft drink industry developed. These drinks would be produced by mixing flavored syrups with carbonated water, though in locations without carbonation equipment, they might be mixed with plain water. The drinks were sweet and flavorful alternatives to alcohol and were particularly popular with customers who did not drink alcohol for religious or personal reasons. Lemonade was made in summer months when lemons were available through trade. The default drink would be prepared by mixing lemon juice with water and sugar, creating a refreshing beverage that was popular in hot weather. Lemons were expensive imports in frontier regions, so lemonade was not an everyday offering, but might be available in better saloons or during special occasions. Fruit juices were occasionally available when fresh fruit could be obtained. Apple cider was the most common fruit beverage in regions where apples were grown, and it might be available in fall after the apple harvest. The cider might be fresh or might be allowed to ferment into hard cider, which would contain alcohol. Other fruit juices would be rare and would depend entirely on local availability of fruit. Mineral waters were bottled and sold commercially in the late 19th century and were available in some saloons. These waters were supposedly healthful due to their mineral content, and they were marketed as having various therapeutic properties. They were expensive relative to other beverages and were specialty items that only better saloons would stock. Hot chocolate was occasionally served in saloons, particularly in winter months. It would be made by mixing cocoa powder or chocolate with hot milk or water and sweetening with sugar. Chocolate was an imported luxury product and was expensive, so hot chocolate was not a common offering, but might be available in more upscale establishments. Sassafras tea was a beverage made from the roots of the sassafras tree and was consumed for its flavor and supposed medicinal properties. The roots would be boiled in water to make a reddish tea with a distinctive flavor. Sassafras was available in some regions and could be gathered wild, making it a cheap beverage option. Ginger beer was a non-alcoholic or low-alcohol beverage made by fermenting ginger, sugar, and water with yeast. It had a spicy, refreshing flavor and was popular in the 19th century. Ginger beer could be made on premises or could be purchased commercially in bottles. The fermentation process created some carbonation, giving the drink a pleasant fizz. The importance of beverages beyond alcohol in saloons should not be underestimated. While most saloon revenue came from alcoholic drinks, the availability of coffee, soft drinks, and other non-alcoholic options made saloons more versatile as gathering places and allowed them to serve a wider range of customers and needs. Men who wanted to socialize or conduct business but who did not want to drink alcohol still had options, and the beverage service enhanced the overall food service experience. Chapter 6: Special Occasions and Celebrations. While most days in saloons followed routine patterns of food service, there were special occasions when saloons would provide more elaborate meals or would host celebrations that featured special food. Let us examine these occasions and what they revealed about saloon food culture. Holidays including Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving, and Independence Day were occasions when saloons might prepare special meals or make extra effort to provide festive food. The degree of celebration depended on the saloon and on local customs, but holidays were generally recognized as times when something special should be offered to customers. Christmas celebrations in frontier saloons might include some special dinner with more expensive meats, perhaps a roasted goose or turkey if available, along with pies and cakes for dessert. The saloon might be decorated with whatever festive materials could be obtained, and the atmosphere would be more celebratory than usual. Free drinks might be offered to regular customers, and the free lunch might be more generous. Christmas was a time when men far from home and family would gather at saloons to find companionship and to mark the holiday in whatever way was possible. New Year's Eve was another major celebration time with saloons staying open late and expecting large crowds. Special food might be prepared, and there would be much drinking and revelry as midnight approached. The food served might not be dramatically different from usual offerings, but quantities would be increased to accommodate the larger crowds, and presentation might be somewhat more festive. Thanksgiving was recognized increasingly as a national holiday during the late 19th century. and saloons in some regions would offer Thanksgiving dinners. These dinners would attempt to replicate traditional Thanksgiving foods, including roasted turkey or chicken, stuffing, potatoes, vegetables, and pie. The gift to kitchen vegetables and pie. The gift of execution would be limited by ingredient availability and kitchen facilities, but the effort would be made to provide something resembling a proper Thanksgiving meal for customers who had nowhere else to go. Independence Day on July 4th was celebrated with patriotic fervor in frontier communities, and saloons would be centers of celebration. There might be outdoor barbecues with beef or pork roasted over open fires, along with side dishes and plenty of drinks. Speeches might be given, toasts would be offered, and the day would be devoted to patriotic expression and drinking. The food would be hearty and plentiful, reflecting American abundance and independence. Local celebrations including town founding anniversaries, the arrival of railroad service, successful cattle drives, and various other community events would be occasions for saloons to provide special food. A saloon might sponsor a barbecue or would provide free food to celebrate with the community. These events built goodwill and reinforced the saloon's position as a community gathering place. Private celebrations including weddings, birthdays, and business successes might be held in saloons, with special food ordered for the occasion. A man celebrating a birthday might treat friends to drinks and might order a special meal for the group. Wedding parties might gather at saloons after ceremonies, with the groom paying for food and drinks. Business deals might be celebrated with meals and rounds of drinks for all involved parties. The food served at these special occasions would be more elaborate than everyday fare, with more expensive meats, more variety, and perhaps desserts that were not normally offered. A special occasion dinner might include steaks or roasted meats, multiple side dishes, fancy pickles and condiments, fresh bread, and pies or cakes for dessert. The presentations might be somewhat more careful and the service might be more attentive. Desserts were generally not a regular part of saloon meals but would appear on special occasions. Pies were the most common dessert option, made with whatever fruit was available, including apples, berries, peaches, or dried fruits. The pies would be made with pastry crusts and sweetened fillings and would be served in slices. Cakes might be baked for very special occasions, though they required more skill and ingredients than pies. Cookies or simple pastries might be offered as accompaniments to coffee. The preparation of special occasion meals required advance planning and additional labor. The saloon cook would need to order special ingredients, would need time to prepare dishes that were not part of the regular routine, and might need assistance from other staff members. The cost of providing special meals would be recovered through charges to customers, or in the case of celebrations hosted by the saloon, would be justified as advertising and community relations expenses. The atmosphere during special occasions would be different from routine days, with more decoration, more noise, more customers, and more festive spirit. The saloon would be transformed temporarily from a working-class drinking establishment into a community gathering place for celebration. These different occasions demonstrated that saloons served social functions beyond simply providing alcohol and basic sustenance, and that they were important institutions in frontier communities. The contrast between special occasion meals and everyday food highlighted the limitations of regular saloon fare. The fact that special meals were notable and worthy of comment shows that routine food was basic and plain. However, the ability of saloons to provide something better when called for demonstrated that the limitations were economic and logistical rather than absolute, and that frontier communities could create more elaborate food experiences when they chose to do so. Chapter 7. Health, Hygiene, and Food Safety. An examination of what food was served in Wild West saloons must address the issues of health, hygiene, and food safety that shaped both the food itself and customers' experiences of eating in these establishments. The standards and practices regarding food safety in the frontier period were very different from modern expectations, and understanding this context is essential. The concept of food safety as we understand it today did not exist in the 19th century. While people understood that spoiled food could make them ill, they did not understand the role of bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms in causing foodborne illness. Germ theory was only developed in the late 19th century and did not become widely understood or applied until the early 20th century. As a result, food handling practices in saloons and other food establishments were crude by modern standards. The storage of food in saloons was challenged by the lack of refrigeration. Ice houses existed in some frontier towns where ice cut from frozen lakes or rivers in winter would be stored in insulated buildings and would be available for purchase during warmer months. Saloons that could afford to purchase ice would have ice boxes where perishable foods could be kept cool. However, ice was expensive and was not available in all locations, and many saloons had no refrigeration at all. Without refrigeration, perishable foods including meat, dairy products, and fresh vegetables would spoil quickly, particularly in summer heat. Saloons would attempt to use these foods quickly after purchase, but spoilage was inevitable. Meat might develop off odors and colors, milk would sour, and vegetables would rot. The practice was to use foods while they were still tolerable, even if they were not at peak freshness. Strong seasonings and cooking methods like frying or stewing would disguise signs of spoilage to some extent. Preserved foods including salted meats, smoked meats, pickles, and canned goods did not require refrigeration and were more reliable from a safety standpoint, though they could still spoil if preserved improperly or if containers were damaged. The high salt content of preserved meats and pickles inhibited bacterial growth, and the canning process killed microorganisms if done correctly. However, botulism from improperly canned foods was a real danger, though it was not understood at the time. Food preparation practices in saloon kitchens were unhygienic by modern standards. Cooks would not wash their hands regularly or systematically, would handle raw meats and then handle other foods without cleaning, would use the same cutting surfaces for different foods, and would follow practices that would horrify modern food safety inspectors. However, these practices were normal for the time and were not seen as problematic because the connection between hygiene and illness was not understood. Dishes and utensils were washed, but the washing process was rudimentary. Dishes would be wiped or rinsed in water that would be reused for multiple batches of dishes without the use of hot water or soap that would effectively remove grease and kill microorganisms. Dishes might be dried with cloths that were themselves dirty. The result was that dishes and utensils were not truly clean and could harbor bacteria that would be transferred to food and to customers. The serving of free lunch created particular hygiene problems because food would sit out at room temperature for hours and would be handled by many different people. Customers would serve themselves from communal bowls and platters, would touch food with unwashed hands, and might return uneaten portions to the communal dishes. This created ideal conditions for the spread of germs and for food contamination. Food poisoning and gastrointestinal illnesses were common consequences of eating free lunch. Water quality was variable and was a significant source of illness in frontier communities. Many water sources were contaminated with waste from humans and animals, and waterborne diseases, including cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, were serious problems. Saloons that obtained water from questionable sources would serve this water to customers and would use it in food preparation, potentially spreading disease. The preference for coffee, beer, and other processed beverages over plain water was partly a safety measure, as boiling water for coffee or fermenting beer killed pathogens. Flies and other insects were constant presences in saloons, would land on food, carrying bacteria and parasites. There were no effective methods for controlling flies beyond swatting them or using primitive fly traps. Food would be covered when possible, but the free lunch spread would necessarily be exposed, attracting flies throughout the day. Customers accepted flies as an unavoidable nuisance and would simply brush them away when eating. Rodents, including rats and mice, were problems in most saloons and would contaminate food stores and food preparation areas. Saloons would attempt to control rodents through traps and cats, but infestations were common. Rodents would chew through sacks of flour and grain, would leave droppings in storage areas, and would spread disease through their presence. The contamination of food by rodents was accepted as a fact of life that could be minimized but not eliminated. The health consequences of poor food safety in saloons were significant. Customers regularly suffered from food poisoning, from point dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases, from point worm infestations from poorly cooked pork, and from various other foodborne illnesses. However, people generally did not connect their illnesses to specific foods or to saloon meals because they did not understand disease transmission. Illness was seen as bad luck or as the result of miasmas or other environmental factors. The lack of regulation of food establishments meant that there were no official standards for cleanliness, no inspections, and no enforcement of hygiene rules. Saloon operators were free to maintain their establishments however they chose, and standards varied enormously. Some saloon owners took pride in running cleaner establishments and understood empirically that cleanliness was good for business, while others paid minimal attention to hygiene. Customers had to judge for themselves which establishments were acceptable. Despite these grim realities, most frontier residents survived, eating in saloons without major health consequences. The human immune system can tolerate considerable exposure to pathogens, and people who grew up in frontier conditions developed some resistance to common diseases. The generally robust health of young working men who made up the saloon clientele meant that they could usually overcome minor foodborne illnesses without serious complications. Nevertheless, food safety issues in saloons contributed to the generally poor public health conditions of frontier communities. The gradual improvement in food safety during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven by scientific understanding of disease transmission, by the development of public health regulations, and by technological improvements including refrigeration and canning, would eventually transform food service. However, during the peak of the Wild West period, saloon food was prepared and served under conditions that were unhygienic and potentially dangerous by any modern standard. Chapter 8: Regional Variations and Specific Examples. Having examined general patterns of saloon food service, let us now consider regional variations and specific examples that show how location and local conditions affected what was served in Wild West saloons. In Kansas cattle towns including Dodge City, Abilene, and Wichita, saloons catered to cowboys who arrived with trail herds from Texas. The food served reflected the preferences and budgets of these cowhands, who had been eating trail food for months and who were eager for hot meals and variety. Beef was naturally abundant and cheap in these locations, and saloons would serve beef steaks, beef stew, and roast regularly. The cowboys were paid at the point end of cattle drives and would spend money freely on food, drink, and entertainment, making cattle town saloons relatively prosperous and able to offer good food service. The Texas influence in Kansas cattle towns meant that some saloons served southwestern dishes including chili, tamales, and other foods that cowboys had encountered in Texas. Mexican and Mexican-American cooks might be employed in saloons, bringing their culinary traditions to frontier menus. The result was a cuisine that blended American frontier cooking with Southwestern and Mexican influences, creating distinctive regional flavors. In Colorado, mining towns including Leadville, Cripple Creek, and Central City, saloons served miners who were paid relatively good wages when mines were productive. The food in mining town saloons could be quite good because customers had money to spend and because supplies could be brought in by rail once railroads reached the mining districts. Fresh oysters, which were shipped packed in ice, were delicacy items that appeared on mining town saloon menus, representing luxury and sophistication. Fancy game dishes, including venison, elk, and wild turkey, might be served in better establishments. However, mining was boom and bust, and when mines played out or when mineral prices dropped, mining towns could collapse rapidly. Saloons in struggling mining areas would revert to basic fare as business declined and as customers became poorer. The feast or famine nature of mining created corresponding swings in saloon food, quality and variety. In California gold, rush towns and later silver mining areas, saloons served an extremely diverse population, including Americans from all regions, Chinese immigrants, Mexican miners, European immigrants, and others. This diversity was reflected in food offerings, with some saloons specializing in particular ethnic cuisines. Chinese restaurants and boarding houses served Chinese food to Chinese miners and to adventurous Americans willing to try unfamiliar dishes. Mexican food was available in areas with Mexican populations. Italian, German, French, and other European immigrants brought their food traditions and sometimes operated saloons serving their traditional foods. San Francisco, as the major city serving California's gold fields, developed a sophisticated saloon and restaurant culture that offered much more elaborate food than frontier saloons in smaller towns. Saloons in San Francisco might serve French cuisine, seafood including local fish and imported oysters, elaborate desserts, and fine wines and spirits. The city's wealth from gold and trade allowed a level of culinary sophistication that was impossible in remote frontier locations. In frontier army posts, saloons that served soldiers offered food that complemented the often monotonous army rations. Soldiers were fed by the army but often sought variety and better quality in civilian establishments. Saloons near military posts would serve fried chicken, steaks, eggs, and other foods that were scarce or poorly prepared in army mess halls. The soldiers' limited pay meant that food had to be affordable, but the steady clientele made saloons near posts reliable businesses. In railroad towns and construction camps, saloons served workers building the Transcontinental Railroad and other lines. These workers included Irish, Chinese, and other immigrant laborers who had distinctive food preferences. Some saloons would cater to specific ethnic groups, serving Irish stew, Chinese noodles, or other familiar foods to homesick workers. Other saloons served basic American frontier fare to mixed clientele. In agricultural areas including the wheat-growing regions of Kansas and Nebraska and the farming valleys of California, saloons had better access to fresh produce during growing seasons. Their menus would feature fresh vegetables and fruits when available, and the overall quality of food might be higher because ingredients were more abundant and cheaper. However, these agricultural regions were often more settled and more family-oriented, and saloons might be less prominent and less rough than in mining or cattle areas. In the Southwest, including New Mexico, Arizona, and southern Texas, the Hispanic and Native American cultural influences created distinctive saloon cuisines. Pozole, a traditional hominy stew, might be served alongside American stew. Beans would be prepared with Mexican spices and techniques. Tortillas might be available alongside or instead of bread. The pulpoir architectural style of saloons in the Southwest, with adobe construction and different layouts than wooden frontier saloons, also influenced how food was prepared and served. In Montana and Wyoming cattle and sheep ranching areas, saloons served ranchers, cowboys, and sheep herders. The long-standing conflict between cattle ranchers and sheep herders might be reflected in saloons that catered to one group or the other. Food would be hearty and meat-heavy, with beef dominant in cattle, country, and mutton available in sheep areas, though mutton was less popular than beef among American customers. In the Pacific Northwest, including Oregon and Washington, saloons had access to abundant salmon and other fish from the Columbia River and coastal waters. Salmon might be smoked, grilled, or served in stews, providing protein that was less common in inland areas. The timber industry created logging camps where saloons served lumberjacks, who were notorious for huge appetites and who consumed enormous quantities of food. Saloons in logging areas would emphasize quantity over quality, serving massive portions of beans, flapjacks, meat, and other filling foods. These regional variations show that, while there were common patterns in saloon food service across the West, local conditions created distinctive cuisines and dining experiences. The availability of ingredients, the ethnic composition of populations, the primary industries, and the wealth of communities all influenced what appeared on saloon menus and how meals were served. Chapter 9. Daily Rhythms and Temporal Patterns. To complete our understanding of what food was served in Wild West saloons, we must examine the daily, weekly, and seasonal rhythms that structured food service. The timing of meals, the flow of customers, and the changes across time periods all affected what was served and when. The daily routine in saloons typically began early, perhaps at 6 or 7 in the morning, when the establishment would open. Early morning customers might include workers heading to jobs who wanted breakfast, travelers preparing to depart town, and men who simply started their days early. Breakfast service in saloons that offered it would consist of the bacon and eggs, biscuits and gravy, fried potatoes, and coffee that we discussed earlier. The breakfast period would last until mid-morning, perhaps until 9 or 10 o'clock. The late morning and midday hours would be relatively quiet in many saloons, with customer traffic being light. This would be a time for preparing the free lunch and for cooking the hot meals that would be served at dinner. The saloon cook would be busy during these hours, making stews, cooking beans, baking cornbread, and preparing whatever dishes were planned for the day. The bartender and other staff might clean, restock supplies, and prepare for the busy afternoon and evening ahead. The dinner hour, which was the midday meal and the main meal of the day, would bring a surge of customers. Working men would take breaks from their labor and would come to saloons for food and perhaps a drink. The free lunch would be set out, and hot meals would be served to those who ordered them. This busy period would last from roughly 11 o'clock until 2 in the afternoon, with constant activity as customers ate, drank, talked, and conducted business. The mid to late afternoon would see continued, but perhaps slightly reduced activity, with the free lunch remaining available and with customers continuing to come and go. Some customers would linger after dinner, drinking and socializing for hours. Others would return to work and would not reappear until evening. The saloon staff might take breaks during this period if they could be spared, grabbing quick meals and resting before the evening rush. The evening hours beginning around 5 or 6 o'clock would bring another surge of activity as workers finished their days and sought entertainment and companionship. Supper might be served for those who wanted an evening meal, though the evening was more focused on drinking and socializing than on eating. The free lunch might be refreshed or might be cleared away depending on the saloon's policy. Card games and other gambling activities would increase as the evening progressed. The late night hours from 9 or 10 o'clock until closing would be the peak time for drinking and rowdy behavior. Food service would be minimal during this time, with most customers interested only in alcohol. However, some customers who had been drinking for hours might want food to fill their stomachs, and simple options, including bread, cheese, crackers, and perhaps leftover stew or beans, might be available for these late-night eaters. Closing time varied, but might be midnight or later. In communities without laws restricting hours, some saloons in rough frontier towns might stay open all night, particularly in mining areas where miners worked different shifts and might want drinks and food at any hour. The decision about when to close would balance the potential revenue from staying open against the exhaustion of staff and the diminishing returns as customer numbers dwindled. The weekly rhythm in saloons was shaped by pay schedules and by social patterns. If workers were paid on Saturdays, then Saturday nights would be the busiest times, with flush customers spending freely on food and drink. Sundays might be quiet if the community was religious and if many people attended church and observed the Sabbath. In less religious or more rowdy communities, Sundays might be busy days when people had leisure time. Weekdays would have more regular patterns tied to work schedules. Market days, when farmers brought produce to town to sell, would be busy days for saloons as farmers would stop in for drinks and food after conducting their business. Court days, when county court was in session and when lawyers, judges, and people involved in legal matters gathered, would create business for saloons near courthouses. Political events, including elections, would cause spikes in saloon activity as men gathered to discuss politics and as candidates might treat voters to drinks. The seasonal patterns in saloon food service were pronounced. Summer would be the season of greatest variety in food, with fresh vegetables and fruits available, with warm weather making outdoor activities possible, and with long daylight hours extending the working day. Summer saloon menus would feature whatever fresh produce could be obtained, and there might be outdoor barbecues and picnic-style meals. Fall would be harvest time, with agricultural communities busy with gathering crops. Saloons in farming areas would see busy periods as harvest workers needed food. Fall would also be the time when cattle drives arrived at railheads, bringing cowboys with money to spend. The cooling weather would make saloons more comfortable after summer heat, and business would generally be good. Winter would be challenging for saloons in cold climates. The difficulty of travel would reduce customer traffic, particularly from rural areas. The scarcity of fresh foods would limit menus to preserved and stored foods. Heating saloons would be expensive, burning wood or coal constantly to maintain tolerable temperatures. However, winter was also a time when men would seek the warmth and companionship of saloons, escaping from cold, dark, and isolated conditions in boarding houses or bunkhouses. Spring would bring renewal and activity as weather improved. Spring cattle drives would begin, mining operations would resume after winter shutdowns, and agricultural work would commence. Saloons would see increased business as the frontier economy revived after winter dormancy. Fresh foods would begin to appear as early vegetables came to market and as the first seasonal produce became available. These temporal patterns meant that what was served in saloons and how food service was conducted varied not just by location but also by time of day, day of week, and season. Understanding these rhythms helps us appreciate that saloon food service was dynamic and responsive to changing conditions rather than static and unchanging. Chapter 10: Cooking Equipment and Kitchen Facilities. To truly understand what food was served in Wild West saloons and how it was prepared, we must examine in detail the cooking equipment and kitchen facilities that were available. The limitations of frontier technology and the constraints of saloon budgets meant that cooking was done with relatively simple equipment under challenging conditions. The wood-burning stove was the central piece of equipment in any saloon kitchen that offered hot food. These cast-iron stoves, which were manufactured by companies including Charter Oak and Home Comfort, were massive, heavy appliances that served multiple functions. The stove would have a firebox where wood would be burned to generate heat, a cooking surface on top with removable lids, allowing pots to be placed directly over the flames, and an oven compartment for baking. Operating a wood stove required constant attention and considerable skill. The cook would need to maintain the fire at appropriate temperatures for different cooking tasks, adding wood as needed and adjusting air vents to control the burn rate. The stove surface would have hotter and cooler zones depending on proximity to the firebox, and experienced cooks would know where to place pots for different purposes. The oven temperature could be controlled somewhat by adjusting the fire and by opening or closing the oven door, but precise temperature control was impossible. The fuel for stoves was wood in most frontier locations, though coal might be used where it was available and affordable. Wood would be purchased by the cord or by the wagon load, or might be cut locally if timber was nearby. The wood would need to be stored in dry conditions and would need to be split into pieces of appropriate size for the stove. The constant need for fuel and the labor of maintaining fires was significant operational costs and burdens. Cast iron pots and pans were the primary cooking vessels used in saloon kitchens. These heavy, durable implements could withstand high heat and constant use. Large pots would be used for making stews, soups, and beans, with capacities of several gallons allowing large batches to be cooked. Skillets or frying pans would be used for frying meats, eggs, and potatoes. Dutch ovens, which were covered cast iron pots that could be used on stovetops or could be buried in coals for baking, were versatile implements used for various purposes. The care of cast iron cookware required seasoning the metal with fat to prevent rust and to create non-stick surfaces. The cookware would be cleaned after use by scraping and wiping, sometimes with coarse salt used as an end abrasive. Soap was generally not used on cast iron as it could damage the seasoning. The cookware would be kept oiled to prevent rust, particularly in humid conditions. Knives for food preparation were simple carbon steel implements that required regular sharpening. A BL saloon kitchen would have several knives of different sizes for different tasks, including butchering meats, chopping vegetables, and slicing bread. The knives would be kept sharp using whetstones, and a skilled cook would maintain knife edges carefully. The handles might be wood, bone, or simple metal tangs. These knives would not be stainless steel, which was not yet widely available, and would require careful cleaning and drying to prevent rust. Cutting boards made from thick wooden planks would be used as work surfaces for food preparation. The boards would be scarred and grooved from constant knife use, and these grooves would harbor bacteria, though this was not understood at the time. The boards would be scraped clean after use but would not be sanitized in any modern sense. Mixing bowls, measuring vessels, and various containers would be made from stoneware, ceramic, or tin. Large stoneware bowls would be used for mixing batches of biscuit dough, bread dough, or other preparations. Pitchers would be used for liquids. Tin cans and jars would be used for storing ingredients, including flour, sugar, salt, and spices. The storage would not be airtight by modern standards, and insects and moisture were constant problems. Utensils, including large spoons, ladles, and spatulas, would be made from wood or metal. Wooden spoons were cheap and would not damage cookware, though they would absorb odors and would harbor bacteria. Metal utensils were more durable but could scratch cast iron surfaces if not used carefully. A saloon kitchen would have a limited selection of these basic implements, and cooks would improvise when specialized tools were not available. Strainers and colanders for draining cooked foods would be simple implements, perhaps just tin vessels with holes punched in them. More sophisticated wire mesh strainers might be available in better equipped kitchens. These tools would be used for draining boiled vegetables, for washing foods, and for various other purposes. The workspace in saloon kitchens was typically a large wooden table or counter where food preparation would occur. This surface would be scarred, stained, and far from sanitary, but it would provide a necessary work area for cutting, mixing, and assembling perfectly dishes. The table might also serve as storage space for frequently used items, including salt, pepper, flour, and other staples that needed to be within easy reach. Water for cooking and cleaning would come from barrels, pitchers, or buckets that would be filled from wells, pumps, or public water sources. Hot water would need to be heated on the stove, which was time-consuming and fuel-intensive. The availability of hot water for dishwashing and kitchen cleaning was limited by the capacity to heat it, and most cleaning would be done with cold or lukewarm water. Dishwashing facilities consisted of basins or buckets where dishes, utensils, and cookware would be washed after use. The water would be cold or barely warm, and soap might or might not be used. The same water would be used for multiple batches of dishes, becoming progressively dirtier and greasier. The washed items would be dried with towels or would be allowed to air dry. The PID result would be dishes that were superficially clean but that retained significant contamination by modern standards. The physical layout of saloon kitchens varied depending on the building design and on the resources available. In the smallest saloons, the kitchen might be just a corner of the main room, with a stove and a small work table. In larger establishments, there might be a dedicated kitchen room with space for multiple workstations, storage shelves, and better organization. The kitchen would typically be located in the back of the building, away from customer areas, though cooking smells and heat would permeate throughout. Ventilation in saloon kitchens was poor, with smoke and heat from stoves creating oppressive conditions, particularly in summer. Some kitchens had chimneys or stovepipes that vented smoke outside, but the heat would remain. Cooks working in these conditions would be hot, sweaty, and uncomfortable throughout their shifts. In winter, the heat from the stove would be welcome, but the temperature swings between the hot kitchen and the cold storage areas would be difficult to manage. Lighting in saloon kitchens was provided by windows during daylight hours and by oil lamps or candles at night. The lighting would be dim by modern standards, making detailed food preparation work challenging. Cooks would learn to work by feel and by feeling experience, developing the skills to produce consistent results despite poor visibility. The limitations of equipment and facilities meant that only certain types of food could be prepared in saloon kitchens. Dishes that required precise temperature control, multiple simultaneous cooking processes, or specialized equipment were not practical. The food that could be made was simple, hearty, and based on slow cooking processes that could be completed in large batches with minimal attention. These equipment constraints shaped the menus as much as ingredient availability or customer preferences did. Chapter 11. The Work Experience of Saloon Cooks and Kitchen Staff. Having examined what food was served and how it was prepared, let us now consider the experiences of the people who did the cooking and kitchen work in Wild West saloons. Understanding their daily lives and working conditions adds an important human dimension to our exploration of saloon food culture. Saloon cooks were working-class people, often women, though men also worked as cooks, who took these jobs out of economic necessity. The position required long hours, hard physical labor, and tolerance for difficult conditions, all for modest pay. Women who worked as saloon cooks might be widows, single women, or married women whose families needed additional income. Men who worked as cooks might be unable to perform harder physical labor due to age or injury, or might have learned cooking skills in the army or in other occupations. The daily routine for a saloon cook would begin very early, perhaps at 5 or 6 in the morning, when the stove would need to be lit and allowed to heat while breakfast preparations began. The cook would start the fire by arranging kindling and wood in the stove's firebox, lighting it, and gradually adding larger pieces of wood. Once the stove was hot, the cook would begin making coffee in large pots, would start frying bacon if breakfast was being served, and would mix biscuit dough for baking. The morning hours would be busy with breakfast service, if the saloon offered it, followed immediately by preparations for the Tintin hour, free lunch, and hot meals. There would be no break between these activities, just a continuous progression from one task to another. The cook would be on her feet constantly, moving between the stove, the work table, the storage areas, and the serving area, performing dozens of different tasks in rapid succession. The physical demands of saloon cooking were considerable. Large pots filled with stew or beans would weigh many pounds and would need to be lifted and moved. Sacks of flour, bags of potatoes, sides of bacon, and other supplies would need to be carried from storage to the kitchen. The cook would stand for 10 to 12 hours or more per day on hard floors, causing foot and leg pain. The heat from the stove in summer would be oppressive, causing profuse sweating and risk of heat exhaustion. The skills required for saloon cooking included not just basic cooking techniques, but also the ability to work quickly under pressure, to manage multiple tasks simultaneously, to estimate quantities without precise measurements, and to improvise when ingredients or equipment were not ideal. An experienced saloon cook would develop efficient routines and would be able to produce large quantities of food with minimal waste and effort. These skills were learned through experience rather than through formal training, and they represented valuable knowledge even though they were not recognized or compensated as professional expertise. The pay pool for saloon cooks was low. typically ranging from perhaps $25 to $50 per month plus room and board, which was roughly comparable to poor other working-class female occupations. Male cooks might earn slightly more. The position offered steady work and reliable income, which had value in the uncertain frontier economy, but it did not provide prosperity or security. Cooks who lost their jobs or who could no longer perform the physical labor would have limited options and might face poverty. The working relationship between cooks and saloon owners varied from poor, relatively respectful to exploitative. Some owners appreciated skilled cooks and treated them decently, recognizing that good food service helped attract customers. Other owners saw cooks as disposable labor and treated them with indifference or contempt. Cooks had little bargaining power and had to accept whatever terms were offered. If they objected to conditions or asked for better pay, they could easily be replaced by other desperate workers. The social status of saloon cooks was ambiguous. On one hand, they were performing respectable labor providing a necessary service. On the other hand, they were working in saloons, which were associated with vice and with social marginality. Female saloon cooks in particular might face moral suspicion simply because they worked in male-dominated drinking establishments. This social stigma was undeserved, but was nevertheless real and affected how cooks were perceived in their communities. The dangers faced by saloon cooks included burns from stoves and hot liquids, cuts from knives, back injuries from lifting heavy items, and respiratory problems from breathing smoke and cooking fumes. There was no workers' compensation, no health insurance, and no safety regulations. Cooks who were injured would have to pay for their own medical care if they could afford it, or would have to simply suffer through injuries and hope they healed. Serious injuries could end a cook's career and could leave them destitute. The interactions between cooks and customers were generally limited, as cooks worked in back kitchens away from the main saloon areas. However, cooks might hear feedback, both complimentary and critical, about their food. A cook whose food was consistently praised might take pride in their work and might develop a reputation that could lead to better opportunities. A cook whose food was complained about might face criticism from the saloon owner and might risk dismissal. The opportunities for advancement for saloon cooks were limited. An experienced cook might be able to move to a better saloon with higher pay, might be able to negotiate somewhat better terms, or might eventually be able to open their own small restaurant or boarding house if they could save enough money. However, most saloon cooks remained in similar positions throughout their working lives, never achieving economic security or social mobility. The personal lives of saloon cooks were constrained by their work schedules and by their low income. Cooks might live in rooms provided by the saloon or might rent cheap rooms nearby. Their free time would be limited to late evenings after the kitchen closed, and perhaps to parts of Sundays if the saloon was closed or less busy. Social relationships and family life would be difficult to maintain given the long hours and the exhausting nature of the work. Despite the hardships, some cooks found satisfaction in their work, taking pride in feeding hungry men and in executing their craft skillfully. The rhythm of kitchen work, the tangible results of producing meals, and the appreciation from satisfied customers could provide meaning and purpose. The kitchen could be a space of relative autonomy, where cooks controlled their domain and made decisions about food preparation, even within the constraints of budget and available ingredients. Understanding the human experience of saloon cooks reminds us that the food served in Wild West saloons was produced through the hard labor of real people working under difficult conditions for modest rewards. The meals that sustained frontier workers were created by other frontier workers whose contributions were essential but often unrecognized and undervalued. Chapter 12: Economic Aspects and Business Models. To complete our understanding of what food was served in Wild West saloons, we must examine the economic aspects of food service and the business models that shaped saloon operations. The financial considerations determined what could be served, how it was presented, and what role food played in overall saloon business. The revenue structure of saloons was dominated by alcohol sales, which typically accounted for perhaps 75 to 90% of total income. Whiskey and beer, the primary products, had high profit margins since the cost of goods was relatively low compared to prices charged to customers. A shot of whiskey that cost the saloon perhaps 5 cents to provide might be sold for 10 or 15 cents, while a beer that cost 3 cents might be sold for 5 or 10 cents. These margins allowed saloons to operate profitably even with relatively modest customer volumes. Food service revenue was secondary and had lower profit margins. The The cost of ingredients and the labor required to prepare food meant that meals sold at prices working men could afford would generate only modest profits. A bowl of punt stew that sold for 25 cents might have ingredient costs of 10 cents and might require significant labor to prepare, leaving limited profit margin. Free lunches actually lost money on punt food costs and were justified only by the drink sales they stimulated. The pricing strategy for saloon food had to balance several considerations. Prices needed to be low enough that working-class customers could afford them, since these men earned only modest wages. Prices needed to cover costs including ingredients, labor, and overhead. Prices needed to be competitive with other saloons and with alternative eating establishments, including boarding houses and restaurants. And prices needed to position food as a value that would attract customers who would then purchase profitable alcoholic drinks. The free lunch model worked economically only if customers who ate the food also purchased drinks. A customer who ate large amounts of free food while nursing a single cheap drink was unprofitable and was discouraged through social pressure and through sometimes enforced informal rules about drink purchases. However, a customer who ate modest amounts of food while consuming multiple drinks was highly profitable, as the food cost would be recovered many times over through alcohol sales. The decision about whether to offer free lunch versus charging for food depended on local competition and market conditions. In towns with many saloons competing for customers, free lunch might be necessary to attract business. In locations with limited competition, saloons might charge for all food. Some saloons would offer both options, providing free lunch during midday hours to attract crowds and charging for more substantial meals. At other times, the costs of operating a saloon food service included not just ingredient costs but also labor costs for cooks and servers, fuel costs for stoves, equipment costs for cookware and utensils, and overhead costs for kitchen space. A saloon owner would need to calculate whether food service would generate enough revenue to justify these costs. In some cases, particularly in small saloons in the early frontier period, food service might be eliminated or minimized because it was not economically viable. The inventory management for food service required careful attention to purchasing, storage, and waste management. Saloon operators would need to purchase supplies in quantities large enough to benefit from bulk discounts, but not so large that foods would spoil before being used. They would need to rotate stock to use older items first and to minimize spoilage. They would need to plan menus based on what ingredients were available and affordable, adapting to seasonal variations and supply disruptions. The counting for food service was typically informal and unsystematic by modern business standards. Saloon owners might keep rough records of purchases and sales, but detailed cost accounting and profit analysis were rare. Many saloon operators relied on intuition and experience rather than on careful financial analysis to make decisions about food service. This meant that inefficiencies and unprofitable practices might continue simply because they were not identified and measured. The capital requirements for setting up food service in a saloon included purchasing stoves, cookware, work tables, dishes, and utensils, as well as stocking initial inventories of ingredients. These upfront costs could be significant for a new saloon and might limit what food services could be offered initially. As saloons became profitable and owners reinvested in the business, food service capabilities could be expanded and improved. The seasonality of frontier economies affected saloon food service economics. During busy seasons when cowboys, miners, or harvest workers were active and had money to spend, saloons would be profitable and could afford to offer better food service. During slow seasons when weather or economic conditions reduced activity, saloons would struggle and might cut back on food offerings to reduce costs. This cyclical pattern was a fact of life in frontier businesses. Competition among saloons created pressure to offer attractive food service, to differentiate establishments, and to build loyal customer bases. A saloon with a reputation for good free lunch or for quality hot meals would have an advantage over competitors. However, offering better food was costly and would only be worthwhile if it generated sufficient additional drink sales to justify the expense. Saloon owners had to judge carefully how much to invest in food service. The integration of food service with other saloon activities, including gambling, entertainment, and lodging, created business synergies. A saloon that offered rooms for rent could provide meals to lodgers as part of boarding packages, creating reliable food service revenue. A saloon that hosted gambling could provide food to gamblers who wanted to stay for long sessions, keeping them on premises and spending money. These integrated business models made food service more economically viable. The long-term viability of saloon food service improved as frontier communities became more established and as infrastructure, including railroads, improved supply chains. In the early frontier, food service was often marginal or unprofitable due to high ingredient costs and limited market. As transportation improved and as communities grew, food service became more feasible and more important to saloon operations. The evolution of frontier economies thus shaped the joint evolution of saloon food culture. The joint economic aspects of saloon food service reveal that what was served and how it was served were determined not just by culinary traditions or customer preferences, but by fundamental business calculations about costs, revenues, and profitability. The food in Wild West saloons was shaped by capitalism and by market forces as much as by culture and by frontier conditions. Chapter 13: Cultural Significance and Social Roles. As we conclude this exhaustive examination of what food was served in Wild West saloons, let us consider the broader cultural significance of saloon food service and the social roles that eating in saloons played in frontier communities. Food was never simply about nutrition, but was embedded in social relationships and cultural meanings. Saloons served as de facto community centers in many frontier towns, particularly in the early stages of settlement when few other gathering places existed. The availability of food in saloons made them accessible at all hours, and made them places where men could satisfy basic needs while also socializing, conducting business, exchanging news, and participating in community life. The saloon was where a stranger arriving in town would go to learn about local conditions, to hear about work opportunities, to make contacts, and to begin integrating into the community. The masculine culture of saloons shaped frontier gender relations, reinforced ideas about male and female social roles. Saloons were spaces where men could escape from domestic responsibilities and could perform masculinity through drinking, gambling, fighting, and rough socialization. The food served in saloons was masculine, food hearty and plain rather than refined, served in a masculine environment. Women who worked in saloons as cooks or servers occupied ambiguous positions, participating in male spaces while remaining marginal to the masculine social bonding that occurred there. The ethnic diversity of frontier populations was reflected in saloon food and created opportunities for cultural exchange and for the development of hybrid cuisines. German immigrants might operate saloons serving sausages and sauerkraut. Irish saloons might serve Irish stew, Chinese establishments might serve noodles and Mexican cantinas might serve tamales and tortillas. Americans of various regional backgrounds would encounter these foods and would sometimes adopt them, creating fusion cuisines that blended traditions. Saloons were thus sites of culinary mixing and innovation, as well as of cultural preservation. The economic role of saloons in providing affordable food to working men was significant in frontier economies, where alternative food sources might be limited or expensive. Cowboys, miners, railroad workers, and laborers depended on saloon food as a primary nutritional source during periods when they were working away from permanent homes. The low prices and generous portions offered by saloons made it possible for working-class men to survive on limited wages. This economic function meant that saloons, despite their associations with vice, played constructive roles in frontier development. The democratic character of saloons, where men of different social classes would mix and interact, was facilitated by food service that was accessible to all. A prosperous rancher and a poor cowhand might eat the same free lunch at the bar, standing shoulder to shoulder in temporary equality. This democratic mixing was limited as racial and ethnic segregation was enforced in many saloons, and women were excluded. However, within the boundaries of who was admitted, saloons offered more social mixing than many other institutions. The nostalgic memory of Wild West saloons and their food has become part of American mythology and popular culture. Saloons are romanticized in Western novels, films, and television shows as colorful, exciting places where frontier adventure unfolded. The food served in these mythologized saloons is often depicted as abundant and wholesome, reflecting frontier prosperity and American plenty. This romanticized memory obscures the reality of often poor food quality and difficult conditions, but it reveals how saloons have been incorporated into American cultural identity and national mythology. The decline of traditional saloons in the early 20th century, driven by prohibition, by changing social attitudes, and by the modernization of the West, marked the end of a distinctive period in American history. Modern bars and restaurants that evoke Western themes are consciously recreating a lost cultural form, and their food service may reference saloon traditions while offering much higher quality and different experiences. The historical saloon remains an object of fascination and nostalgia even as its actual practices and conditions are largely forgotten. The study of saloon food service contributes to broader historical understanding of frontier life, of working-class culture, of the development of American cuisine, and of the social institutions that shaped Western settlement. Food historians, Western historians, and cultural historians all find valuable evidence and insights in examining what people ate, where they ate, and how eating functioned in daily life. The seemingly mundane question of what food was served in saloons opens windows into much larger historical questions about how American society developed and how people lived during periods of rapid change and development. As you finally, long last, drift off to sleep after this remarkably thorough, exhaustively detailed, and deliberately soporific exploration of what food was served at Wild West saloons, you can rest knowing that you have gained comprehensive knowledge of frontier food culture that few possess. The free lunches with their bread, cheese, pickles, and salted meats, the hot meals of stew and beans and biscuits, the coffee that flowed constantly, the seasonal variations and regional differences, the hard work of cooks, laboring over wood stoves, the economic calculations of saloon owners, and the social significance of eating in these rough frontier establishments have all been examined in minute detail. You now understand not just what was served, but why it was served, how it was prepared, who prepared it, what it cost, and what it meant in the larger context of American frontier history. Sleep well, dear listener, with visions of steaming bowls of beef stew, plates of bacon and eggs, and endless pots of strong frontier coffee. May your dreams be peaceful and your rest profound. Good night.